Have you ever seen a Bible with 88 books? Chances are your answer is no. What if I told you there's a Bible that predates the King James Version, that holds scriptures you've never heard of, stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about early Christianity? It doesn't come from Rome. It doesn't come from Europe. It comes from a mountainous monastery in Ethiopia, a land of kings, fire-scarred scrolls, and mysteries untouched by colonization. Hidden away in ancient Ge'ez script lies a Bible preserved for over 1,000 years, not in glass cases of the Vatican, but in the hands of quiet monks who've passed it down generation after generation. It includes books like Enoch, Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, and even letters attributed to Clement, texts the modern church either lost or chose to forget. So why hasn't the world heard of this? Why is the Ethiopian Bible, with its rich canon, deeper Old Testament, and even alternative teachings, almost unknown to the average Christian? Is it just forgotten history or something deliberately buried? Because here's the twist. Ethiopians were already following the God of the Bible long before Europe ever adopted Christianity. Before cathedrals, crusades, councils, there were scrolls, and Ethiopia had them. So what happened? In this journey, we'll uncover the story of the world's oldest Bible, the controversies that erased it, and why, even today, some people don't want you to know it exists. This is not just about a book. It's about the truth that got left behind. Long before the printing press, before pulpits echoed with European sermons, before the Council of Nicaea ever drew its lines in the sand, there was Ethiopia, a land older than most nations, untouched by colonizers, where Christianity took root not by conquest, but by conviction. It is here, carved into the rocks of Lalabella's stone churches, hidden in mountain monasteries above the clouds, that the world's oldest Christian texts have been preserved, not by empires, but by monks and kings who saw faith not as power, but as legacy. The Ethiopian Bible, written in Ge'ez, a sacred language spoken now only in prayer, holds 81 to 88 books, depending on the canon. For comparison, the King James Bible has just 66. So where did the rest go? Inside its pages lie books long banished from Western Christianity: the Book of Enoch, describing angels who descended to earth and altered mankind; Jubilees, retelling Genesis through a divine lens of time and order; ancient epistles and prophecies never heard from Western pulpits. And here's the catch. Ethiopians didn't adopt Christianity. They already had it. By the 4th century AD, Christianity was Ethiopia's state religion, the first in the world after Armenia. Yet archaeological and oral traditions suggest the seeds were sown even earlier, perhaps by the eunuch of Candace, baptized by Philip in the book of Acts. What does that mean? That while Rome was still persecuting Christians, Ethiopia was already sheltering them. While Europe debated what books to keep, Ethiopia had preserved them all. This wasn't just a different version of the Bible, it was a parallel reality, one that survived fire, war, and time itself. But to truly understand the magnitude of what Ethiopia preserved, we need to journey deeper into these forgotten texts themselves. The Book of Enoch alone contains revelations that would shake the foundations of modern theology. It speaks of the Watchers, fallen angels who descended from heaven, took human wives, and gave birth to the Nephilim, giants who corrupted the earth before the flood. These aren't just stories. They're detailed genealogies, prophecies, and cosmic secrets that explain the origins of evil itself. The Ethiopian monks didn't just preserve these words, they lived by them. For over 15 centuries, they've incorporated these teachings into their liturgy, their prayers, their understanding of the divine. While Western Christianity debated whether angels could sin, Ethiopian priests were reading the detailed accounts of exactly how they fell. Then there's the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis. It retells the creation story with precision that's almost mathematical, breaking down time into perfect cycles of 7, revealing a cosmic calendar that predates any earthly kingdom. It explains why certain days are holy, why certain numbers appear throughout Scripture, and provides answers to questions that mainstream Christianity simply ignores. But perhaps most intriguing are the prophetic books that speak of Ethiopia itself. The Kebra Nagast, the Glory of the Kings, tells the story of how the Queen of Sheba journeyed to Jerusalem, fell in love with Solomon's wisdom, and returned to Ethiopia carrying not just his child, but the Ark of the Covenant itself. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark never left. It rests today, they claim, in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Axum. It's guarded by a single monk who will never leave its presence until the day he dies. No photographs, no scientific analysis, just faith and a secret that's been kept for 3,000 years. The West calls it legend, Ethiopia calls it history, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the difference between the Ethiopian Bible and ours isn't isn't just about which books survived. It's about how we see the relationship between heaven and earth, between the mystical and the mundane. We can prove and what we choose to believe. But if the Ethiopian Bible is so rich, so ancient, so complete, why was it cast aside? To answer that, we must step into the heart of early church history, where faith met politics and not everyone agreed on what Christianity should look like. In 325 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine called together bishops from across the empire. Their mission? To unify a divided faith. What followed was the Council of Nicaea, the first time the church attempted to define Christianity by consensus and control. Books were debated, scrolls were burned, and slowly the Bible was trimmed, reshaped, and standardized. Not necessarily by spiritual guidance, but by imperial strategy. Only texts that aligned with the empire's message were kept. Others, like the ones cherished in Ethiopia, the Book of Enoch, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Ascension of Isaiah, were labeled heretical, non-canonical, or simply too mystical. They were not lost. They were deliberately left out. The Roman Church called them pseudo-epigrapha, falsely attributed, but Ethiopia never let go. The reasons run deeper than mere theological disagreement. Rome needed a Christianity that could govern an empire, streamlined, hierarchical, and politically useful. The mystical revelations preserved in Ethiopia spoke of cosmic battles, angelic hierarchies, and divine mysteries that threatened earthly authority. How do you control a population that believes they have direct access to heavenly secrets? How do you maintain religious hierarchy when ancient texts suggest that ordinary people can receive visions of the divine throne? The Ethiopian texts were dangerous not because they were false, but because they were too true, too wild, too uncontrollable. Consider the political implications of the Book of Enoch's detailed descriptions of corrupt leadership, of earthly rulers who align themselves with fallen angels, of a coming judgment that would sweep away all human kingdom. Rome couldn't canonize a text that essentially predicted its own downfall, so they didn't just exclude these books, they actively suppressed them. Monasteries were raided, manuscripts were confiscated, scholars who taught from these texts were excommunicated. Within a few centuries, most of the Christian world had forgotten these books ever existed. But Ethiopia was different. Geographically isolated by mountains and deserts, politically independent and spiritually autonomous, Ethiopia never submitted to Roman ecclesiastical authority. When Rome said, remove these books, Ethiopia said no. When Constantinople demanded conformity, Ethiopian monks simply closed their monastery doors and continued copying the texts by candlelight. This isolation wasn't just geographical, it was intentional. Ethiopian Christianity developed its own theological language, its own interpretive traditions, its own understanding of what it meant to follow Christ. They weren't rebels or heretics, they were simply original. Centuries later, King James I of England would follow the same path. In 1611, his authorized Bible, elegant, poetic, and politically neutral, would become the global standard. But it would only include 66 books shaped by scholars who never even read Ge'ez, never touched the Ethiopian canon. The King James translators worked from Greek and Hebrew manuscripts that had already been filtered through centuries of Roman Catholic and Protestant editing. They were translating translations of translations, each generation removing another layer of mystical complexity in favor of doctrinal clarity. Meanwhile, in the highlands of Ethiopia, monks were still copying directly from manuscripts that predated Constantine by centuries. They weren't translating, they were preserving. The difference is profound, and so the divide grew. In the West, a streamlined, edited Bible. In Ethiopia, a vault of scripture the rest of the world would forget. The irony is staggering. The very books that Western Christianity discarded as too mystical or too Jewish were the ones that provided the clearest explanations for the supernatural elements that remained in the canonical scriptures. Without the Book of Enoch, the brief mention of sons of God in Genesis becomes incomprehensible. Without Jubilees, the chronology of the Old Testament becomes impossible to follow. Without the additional psalms and prayers, the emotional depth of David's relationship with God remains surface level. Ethiopia kept the keys to understanding the very mysteries that Western Christianity claims to believe in, but can no longer fully explain. Even as Ethiopia faced Islamic invasions, colonial aggression, and devastating fires, the Bible remained scarred, preserved, sacred. The survival of these texts through Ethiopia's turbulent history reads like a miracle in itself. When Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Ahmad Gran, swept across the Ethiopian highlands in the 16th century, burning churches and massacring priests, the monks didn't just hide themselves, they hid the books. Manuscripts were sealed in clay jars and buried in mountain caves. Others were smuggled across desert routes to distant monasteries. Some were were literally sewn into the robes of fleeing monks, carried across hundreds of miles of hostile territory in desperate attempts to preserve what Rome had already abandoned. When Italian forces occupied Ethiopia in the 1930s, one of their first acts was to loot the ancient libraries. Mussolini's scholars weren't just interested in conquest, they were hunting for the very texts that European Christianity had lost. The irony wasn't lost on Ethiopian monks who watched foreign armies steal back the books their own ancestors had discarded centuries earlier. But the manuscripts survived, hidden in secret chambers beneath stone churches, wrapped in centuries-old leather and stored in monastery attics, memorized by illiterate monks who couldn't read the ancient Ge'ez script but could recite entire books from memory. Today, scholars are beginning to return to it, uncovering books once banned, ideas once feared, and stories that might change everything we thought we knew. The rediscovery began quietly in the 18th century when European travelers and missionaries first encountered Ethiopian Christianity and realized it was unlike anything they'd seen before. James Bruce, the Scottish explorer, was among the first to bring copies of the Book of Enoch back to Europe in 1773. European scholars were stunned. Here was a complete text that had been quoted extensively in the New Testament, but had been completely lost to the Western world. But it wasn't just about recovering lost manuscripts. It was about recovering lost ways of thinking about faith itself. Ethiopian Christianity had preserved not just different books, but different approaches to interpreting scripture, different understandings of the relationship between the human and divine, different answers to the fundamental questions that had divided Christianity for centuries. Modern biblical archaeology has begun to vindicate many of the historical claims found only in the Ethiopian canon. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, contain fragments of several books that existed nowhere else except in the Ethiopian Bible. Suddenly, texts that had been dismissed as late fabrications were proved to be among the oldest Jewish writings ever discovered. The implications ripple outward in every direction. If the Ethiopian Bible preserved authentic ancient texts that the Western Church had lost, what else had they preserved? What other insights into early Christianity, what other approaches to understanding scripture, what other pieces of the puzzle had survived in the highlands of Africa while the rest of the Christian world moved on without them? The questions become even more provocative when you consider the theological implications. The Ethiopian understanding of angels, demons, and spiritual warfare is far more detailed and sophisticated than anything found in mainstream Christian theology. Their calendar, based on the Book of Jubilees, suggests a completely different understanding of sacred time. Their Christology, influenced by texts like the Ascension of Isaiah, presents a Jesus who is simultaneously more human and more divine than the figure presented in Western Christianity. These aren't just academic curiosities. These are fundamental questions about the nature of faith, the reliability of religious authority, and the possibility that Christianity as it developed in Europe and America may have lost essential elements that survived only in Africa. Because the real question isn't why the Ethiopian Bible was hidden. It's what it still holds that we aren't ready to see. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the Ethiopian Bible doesn't just challenge what Western Christianity teaches, it challenges what Western Christianity claims is possible to know. The detailed angelic hierarchies, the precise calendrical calculations, the intricate prophetic timetables all suggest a Christianity that was far more mystical, far more connected to cosmic realities, far more comfortable with mystery than the faith that emerged from European theological debates. This wasn't a primitive or simplified Christianity that needed to be corrected by more sophisticated European theology. This was a Christianity that had access to sources, traditions, and ways of understanding that Europe had systematically abandoned in favor of institutional control and doctrinal uniformity. The Ethiopian Bible forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility that the version of Christianity that conquered the world may not have been the most complete version, that in our rush to make faith rational, controllable, and politically useful, we may have lost the very elements that made it transformative. The monks in their mountain monasteries aren't just preserving old books, they're preserving a way of seeing reality that includes dimensions Western Christianity has forgotten how to perceive. They're maintaining traditions that suggest the boundary between heaven and earth is far thinner, far more permeable than our sanitized theology admits. And maybe that's exactly what we're not ready to see. Maybe the Ethiopian Bible remains hidden not because it's false, but because it's too true, too wild, too dangerous to the comfortable assumptions that have shaped centuries of Christian thought. The question that remains is whether we're finally ready to receive what Ethiopia never stopped preserving, whether we're prepared to encounter a Christianity that's larger, stranger, and more mysterious than the one we thought we knew. The scrolls are still there, in the mountain monasteries waiting. The monks are still copying, still praying, still preserving what the rest of us lost. The only question is whether we're brave enough to go looking for what we left behind. Because this isn't just about recovering lost books. It's about recovering a lost way of being Christian, a way that includes angels and giants, cosmic calendars and prophetic mysteries, direct divine revelation and mystical encounters that can't be reduced to systematic theology. Ethiopia kept it all. The question is whether the rest of us are ready to receive it back.